Hello, this is Bob Lewis of boblewisministries.org. Um, I'm at the age, of course, where I'm home more than I'm out working, and that's an adjustment. But I'm going through a lot of files. I'm throwing away a lot of things. I'm finding lots of things. Have you ever done that? If you're up in years, or even if you're not up in years, maybe you've done that. You've been going through some old things that you'd saved and you'd kept. You don't even remember why you saved some of them. And I came across this article back in the day when I was the director of missions in Sacramento Region Baptist Network. We'd write. I used to write. We used to have like weekly and then bi-weekly, and finally we went to monthly newsletters um, to the churches, and of course the director of missions, always like a pastor, always had an article. And so my article, another drop in the bucket, was the general title of the editorials that I would write. And I got a lot of, uh, even as a pastor, I got letters from people who had read my articles, which is good. I think it makes, if people are thinking, if they're engaging, I think that's good. But some of them weren't very nice letters to people that didn't like what I wrote. So I'm used to that kind of thing. I'm kind of thick-skinned, sort of, a little bit. It's not as thick as it used to be, but anyway, I published this in January of 2003, and this is the reason I was always in trouble with mainly my friends at the state convention didn't always like my articles, but I calls them as I sees them. But this was about another article that was written by Lyle Schaller, who was a guru in church growth, and he was a very wise man. And even though he wasn't Baptist, he was a true Christian, but he was just from another denomination, but had such insight on church organizational things that he was sought after. And I know I read his books, and many other Southern Baptist pastors did. They were very helpful. And in a magazine called Net Results, they published an editorial by him in January of 2003. And it was about that time that I read it and quoted him in an article. And in January of 03, Lyle Schaller did a study on church planting in the United States. And this is the things he said. And he was always so far ahead of his time that you know what happens when you get so far ahead of your time and say things that people haven't thought about, or they take them in a wrong way. They think you're being disrespectful, or you're negative, or you're an enemy or something. But you can see why when you let me read this paragraph that he wrote. He said, a highly subjective guess. So he's hedging himself here a little bit, and yet he was right on because we've lived through all this time, is that planting a new Protestant mission in the United States in the early years of the 21st century, and for all of you younger people, we are now in the 21st century. It is at least 5 times as expensive and 10 times more difficult than it was in 1953, talking about planting churches. Compared to 1883, it may have been 100 times more expensive today and 50 times more difficult than to plant churches. In the 1880s, new churches were launched to fill a vacuum. Today, most are planted in highly competitive and far more demanding ecclesiastical environments. That explains why fewer than 1/2 of new churches average more than 150 at worship a decade after the first public worship service is held. So 10 years after they're planted, they're still just running around 150. And he goes on to conclude that church planting should no longer be ranked in the top 5 priorities for denominations in this country as a vehicle for evangelization and kingdom growth. And to quote him, he says, "What was a moderate success tactic in contemporary urban and suburban America is no longer even slightly successful." So, wow, when you look back from 2020 to 2003 and see that he already saw this was happening, and now look at it. Now, some of you haven't had the advantage that I've had in studying this because you don't read books about churches and church planning. You don't work with church planners. You don't see how hard it is for them to plant a church and how difficult it is. You don't see the mechanisms that our Southern Baptist Convention has to help those people and how little help. I'm going out on a limb here. What little help it is. Uh, and yet, it's all about statistics somehow in our denomination, and that's killed us. Um, but that's another op-ed. Uh, so I can verify that this is all happened, even though I listened to him and I did not disagree with him then because I'd been trying to help church planners in the 1990s, and I began realizing in the 1990s that whoa, this is not like it used to be. This is totally different. Uh, Still, he helped me to face reality. But when you're so far ahead of everyone else and you write stuff like he did, and then you reprint it like I did, uh, people that haven't really been thinking about these things see it as you're negative. You don't like Baptist. You don't like Southern Baptist. You don't, and so it's if you don't have the same understanding and information, you can take it all in a wrong way, and that's what happened. Uh, People took this, from him. He was so famous, they just read it and slumped it off. But me, a little nobody in an association, and not in the Bible Belt, but in California, it was like I was being very negative. Um, and I get that. It did seem negative, unless it was the truth. And now we know it was the truth. So when I retired at 58 from being a director of missions and did other ministries for 10 years before coming back to help with family in 2017, back to our house, moved back in with my daughter to this house in Citrus Heights. And I started visiting churches that I had known and loved for many years. I can't tell you how shocked I was, even though I knew this was happening and I'd watched it to some extent. I wasn't ready for what I saw. Churches that were running in our association 400, some of them more than 400, or under 100, and just struggling to stay alive. Churches that had youth groups and had younger and middle-aged people. Now it was mainly just people like me. Old people with grandkids being tagged along, and a whole lot of others missing. And that made me very sad, even though I'd been writing about it. It's still the reality of it, that what we had been blowing the horn about, that this is happening. It was very hard to see that we'd gotten to this place. And yet, here's the thing that worries me as kind of step back a few feet, and I become a person that mainly observes and watches rather than being in the game. It's like nobody still realizes what's happened and what's going to happen and what's inevitable to happen. We've already lost for the kingdom of God millions of dollars in, if nothing else, in just property. And it's going to continue by not being wise. It's going to continue. And we're right at the end right now, where soon somebody's going to say, well, let's lock the door and put close sign on it. That's sad. But does that mean if a denomination dies, does that mean Christianity is dead? No. If Christianity has no buildings to meet in with a sign out in front on the street, does that mean Christianity is dead? No. Sometimes that's what's needed for it to begin to flourish. Meeting in homes, meeting in rented halls, meeting out in a park, meeting in smaller groups and more of them. In the first 3 centuries, that's the way the church took over the Roman Empire, because there were no buildings. It was against the law. But they still, even though they were put to death and it was against the law, they continued to spread through love and sharing the good news to their neighbors. Loving your neighbors, sharing the good news, and meeting together for encouragement and Bible study and to break bread together. So there is hope. There's always hope. And you can always look at something that at first seems like a big tragedy. And you can see something else happening that turns out to be a big blessing. This is Bob Lewis with another video log saying, till next time.